Hi everyone. We're going to continue to discuss the Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation. And we're going to look at a game Carlsen versus Kramnik from 2016. It's a beautiful positional masterpiece by Carlsen. So Carlsen has the white pieces, opens with d4, double Queen's pawn opening, and then we get the Queen's Gambit. Okay, we discussed in the last part of the series that e6 is referred to as the Queen's Gambit declined, and black is trying to go for a strong point defense. If white takes the pawn on d5, black's going to replace that with another pawn and keep control of the e4 square. Knight c3, knight f6, and now Carlsen initiates the exchange variation. Exchanges pawns on d5, and now he needs to get his minor pieces developed. Do you remember the standard order in which they are developed? Okay, first we get the dark squared bishop out so that we can move the pawn forward to e3, and that bishop would be outside of this pawn chain. Next, we can develop the light squared bishop, probably to d3, and once that gets out of the way, the knight can get behind it on e2. That was the standard order of development we learned in the last part of the series. Let's see what happens in this game. Carlsen does go for bishop g5, which remember comes with a threat. So white is threatening to take the knight, and if black recaptures with the queen, he loses the d5 pawn. If he recaptures with the g-pawn, then he has a terrible kingside pawn structure. So in the last part of the series, we looked at the move bishop to e7 to address that threat. So now black can recapture with the bishop and the pawn is secure. And this is a great move because it unpins the knight, it gets ready for castling, so it's the most common move in the position. But there are a couple of other ways to address white's threat and a couple of other common moves that are sometimes played. In this game, Kramnik didn't go for bishop to e7. Instead, he played this move c6, which does defend the d5 pawn. So now that addresses the threat. If white takes on f6, black can recapture with the queen, and the pawn is secure. Before we continue with the game, let's point out another move in the position that does also address the threat and is sometimes played. Knight b d7. So the point of this is if white captures on f6, black can recapture with the knight, and again the pawn on d5 will be safe, and the pawn structure will be safe as well. By the way, if you're playing white and your opponent makes this move, you may be tempted to grab this pawn thinking that the knight on f6 is pinned. Well, this is actually a standard opening trap. It's known as the elephant trap, and it's actually a mistake. It's a blunder to take that pawn. You're simply going to lose a minor piece and go down material. Turns out the knight on f6, which is only in a relative pin, not an absolute pin, should capture the knight. Brilliant move. So the queen is on pre here, and white probably should at least try taking it, because otherwise white is simply down a whole piece for a pawn, and his bishop is under attack right now. So let's see what happens if white takes the queen. Well, here's the point of black's play. Bishop b4 check. How can white get out of check? Only one way, to block with the queen. So white's going to lose his queen in turn. Black takes it with check. White has to get out of check, might as well take the bishop. And then black can take the bishop on d8. So if you look at the piece count, black has an extra knight for a pawn. So it's a winning material advantage for black. So don't fall for that elephant trap, which is being set here with knight b d7. So that looks like that pawn is free, but it's not. You've got this bishop check coming. So what should you do if black does play knight bd7? Well, you should continue your standard development plan that we just talked about. You should play e3, creating the pawn chain with your bishop outside of the pawn chain. And then black plays usually the standard moves, including bishop to e7, c6, short castles, and so forth, like we saw in the last video. For example, maybe c6, bishop d3, bishop e7. Queen c2 is a useful move to create a battery here, get the queen off the back rank. Castles. And do you remember our plan with the kingside knight? So in the last part of the series, we developed it to e2, and you'll see why. If rook e8, we can castle, secure the king before attempting any operations in the center of the board. Knight f8, typical maneuver for that knight, remember. It's going to go to the g6 square. It's getting out of the way of the light squared bishop. And now white plays f3. So that's why the knight is on e2, not blocking the f pawn. So the pawn on f3 can support the e pawn to come forward to the center. So it will be defended by the f pawn. So this is the position we arrived at in the last part of the series. So let's back up. So if you do see knight bd7, just continue on with your standard development plan. All right, but as I said, in this game, Kramnik played the move c6. Do you remember the purposes of that move? Well, black wants to develop the light square bishop, and the ideal square to place it on is f5. Usually c6 is played before that bishop is developed, so that's a signal that black wants to develop the bishop. The reason why c6 is played before developing the bishop, recall, is the pawn on c6 defends d5. So if white responds with queen to b3 after this bishop is developed, then there will be no attack on d5. Also, if queen to b3 comes attacking the b7 pawn, then queen to b6 can be the response to block that attack. So this is securing d5 and opening a diagonal for the queen. So it's allowing this bishop to be comfortably developed. So this is a very early c6. It's done before development of the dark square bishop or the knight. So black is prioritizing getting the light squared bishop developed. It's hard to develop that piece in this exchange variation. So black is trying to get it developed right away. He wants to move it to f5 on the next move. And he has secured d5, so there's no longer a threat here of taking on f6. Well, if you see c6, there are a couple of ways to play the position. Very natural thing you could do here, which is not what Carlsen did, is to play queen to c2 early. Since you haven't moved your pawn to e3 yet, you can't get your bishop to d3 immediately. Use the queen to control f5. So you can stop that dark square bishop from getting to f5 like this. And sometimes the game will just transpose into the positions we've looked at already. For example, bishop e7, breaking the pin, e3 now, knight bd7, or perhaps castling. Some of these moves are interchangeable. Bishop d3, castles, knight g e2, keeping the f pawn mobile, rook e8, castles short, knight f8, and finally f3. So same position we looked at earlier, and this is what could have occurred in the game if Carlsen played queen to c2 to stop black's plan of developing the light squared bishop. But instead, Carlsen went for another common plan in this position. He played e3, allowing the bishop to come to f5 because white has a very specific follow-up in mind. And this is the way we're going to recommend playing the position. So Kramnik does play bishop f5. Okay, and by the way, some players don't follow through with bishop f5 because of the specific follow-up white has in mind that we're going to see in a minute. Some players just simply play bishop e7 and continue with ordinary development and transpose back into that same position again after moves like the following. And we're back to where we were. But Kramnik followed through with his idea of playing bishop to f5 in the position. So what did Carlsen have in mind? Why did he allow that move, bishop f5? Well, he followed up with queen to f3, attacking the bishop. Normally you don't want to develop your queen early in the game, but there's a very specific tactical sequence that is about to happen that justifies it. So Kramnik drops the bishop back to g6 to protect it so he doesn't lose it. And now there are two pieces pointed at that knight on f6. So the point of Carlsen's play is to destroy the pawn cover on the king side here, like this. Bishop takes f6, okay, queen takes f6, queen takes f6, and g takes f6. So that was the idea. So that's the price black had to pay to get that bishop out early. He had to allow his kingside pawn structure to be damaged like this. We've got these double isolated pawns. We've got that isolated h-pawn. Backing up just a moment, after black saved his bishop by moving it to g6 and white takes on f6, you may wonder, can black consider this move instead of taking with the queen first? Well, you can do that, but I think the position favors white because with the queens on the board, this queen becomes a very strong attacking unit, and it can attack the pawn on f6, and it can also threaten to attack the black king. So black in this position usually opts to get the queens off the board. So white has less firepower to take advantage of black's weaknesses. All right, so what does Carlsen do from here? Black obviously has a structural weakness in his pawn structure, but what's white's plan? Well, Carlsen has a brilliant positional plan here. He notices the square in front of the f6 pawn is very weak, and he would like to occupy it with a knight. Why is that square weak? Well, when we say a square is weak, it's usually because no pawns can attack it. So there are no black pawns here, 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 or here that can ever dislodge a white piece from f5. However, currently the bishop is defending f5, so what Carlsen wants to do is maneuver both of his knights to point at that f5 square and occupy it with one of the knights, and if the bishop takes a knight, then Carlsen will replace it with the other knight, and he'll guarantee to have a great outpost square for his knight, and it won't be easy to drive it away. He begins with knight f3. That knight is actually headed for h4, so it can put pressure on that f5 square. Knight d7, just developing the knight. Knight h4. Now that knight is not going to take that bishop and either straighten out black's pawn structure or give him a semi-open h-file. It doesn't want to do that. He wants to concentrate on that weak square there. Bishop e7, defending f6 further, perhaps castling kingside. Knight e2, very strange looking move if you don't understand white's plan of maneuvering both knights toward the f5 square. This is the way this knight gets there. Okay, now Kramnik plays knight b6, and then knight g3. Both knights are pointed at f5. And you may have noticed that for the last couple of moves, Carlsen has allowed this check, which Kramnik plays at the moment. Well, Carlsen was not afraid of that check. He merely moved his king to the side. Castling doesn't interest him in this particular position. Often we talk about securing our king, getting it safe, castling early in the game. Good advice for beginner players. But sometimes it's perfectly safe to leave your king in the center or to walk it over to a safe square without castling. And usually that's possible when the queens are off the board like this. So there are less attacking possibilities. And also notice there are no open files in the position. So it's partly closed off here. And that makes for a safer terrain for you to maneuver your kings around in. So Carlsen is not at all afraid of moving his king over. In fact, his king may come over to the queen side and support these pawns. So Kramnik plays knight a4, seemingly threatening the b2 pawn, and Carlsen ignores it. He plays knight gf5, following through with his plan of occupying that square with a knight, supported by his other knight. Why does he allow this pawn to be taken? Well, it's a poisoned pawn, and it takes a lot of calculation to see that. Kramnik did see it, and he played king to d7, moving his own king without castling. We'll discuss why in a moment. But let's see what would have happened if black had taken that pawn. It's kind of hard to resist. Many, beginner or intermediate players would play that move because it comes with check. After all, it looks like a free pawn. Well, in that case, white would play king to c2, attacking the knight. And the knight has two safe squares to retreat to. Let's look at each one. If he retreats to a4, then white can attack both minor pieces at the same time. And it turns out the only move here for black, in order not to lose a whole minor piece, is to move the bishop and attack the rook. So the bishop is defended by the knight, and if white takes the knight, black gets the rook. Well, white still wins material in the position with rook to c1. The threat is to take the bishop and gain two minor pieces for the rook. Okay, also notice how white is threatening the knight with the king right now. Now that the rook is not under threat, white can take the knight and follow it up with taking the bishop. The knight cannot move away to save itself because it's currently protecting the bishop. The bishop will be taken. So what does black do in the position? Well, the best he can do is protect his knight and allow the capture on c3, giving white two minor pieces for the rook, which, by the way, does not sound like that big of a material advantage. If you count up the points, minor pieces are generally considered to be 3 points each, a rook 5 points, so it looks like a 6 to 5 material trade. But usually two minor pieces, especially if one of them is a bishop, are much better than a rook, much better than 1 point advantage. If I turn the engine on in this position, it settles on somewhere around a 2.5 to 3 point advantage. Yeah, it's up to 2.7 right now. I'm watching at depth 20. It's up to 2.9. So it's a big advantage for white in the position to make that trade. So going back, knight to a4 is not so good. What if he played knight to c4? Well, in this case, white can trade minor pieces on c4 and then attack the bishop with a rook, skewering the pawn on b7, meaning if the bishop moves out of the way, then this pawn on b7 will be taken by the white rook, and not only will white win that pawn, but his rooks will become very active. Getting rook on the 7th rank like that is great, and white again will have a strong advantage in the position. So maybe black doesn't move the bishop and he tries to defend it. He can defend it with either a5 or c5, but the counter move is the same either way. A3 is going to force it to move out of the way. And by the way, that explains why moving the H rook to B1 is better than moving the A rook to B1. The reason the H rook is moved is because now A3 can be played and the rook on A1 is supporting the A pawn, so black cannot take it. Okay, so black would have to move the bishop to A5 and the pawn on B7 would fall, and white's rooks are getting very active in the position. So white has a strong advantage again. So all of that is to say the pawn on B2 is poisoned, and Kramnik did not take it. He played king to D7, showing Carlsen that he too can move his king in the center of the board and not worry about castling. But what's the point of that move? Well, he's intending to get the king to E6 to attack that knight. He can't just let these knights sit like this on these squares. So he wants to dislodge that knight. Okay, at this point, Carlsen defends the B2 pawn, which we just a moment ago said was poison. Why does he do this? Well, it's because Carlsen wants to play bishop to D3 to protect that knight, which is about to be attacked for a second time. And if he puts his bishop on D3 and that pawn is unprotected, then knight takes B2 is a different story because it's forking the king and the bishop. All right, and so black would be able to trade off his knight for the D3 bishop, and he will not lose any material. So before playing bishop D3, rook to B1 prepares that move. Now Kramnik plays king E6, attacking the knight, so it's under attack twice, it's only defended once. So white has to do something about that, and he's just in time with bishop to D3. Okay, now Kramnik plays rook H C8, probably intending to push his C pawn forward and open up the C file, trying to get some activity for his pieces. This bishop, by the way, is completely dead unless he wants to trade it off. It's not doing anything over on this side of the board. It cannot even retreat because of the poor pawn structure. Okay, king E2, activating the other rook, giving the other rook some scope here to move. Bishop F8, getting the bishop out of the way. Now that the rook has moved over here, this move does not cut off the rooks and separate them. So just falling back, probably getting away from any pawn pushes here. And then Carlsen plays G4, lending further support to the knight on F5 and giving his other knight a square to move to. Like to get to F4 perhaps, and do some activity in another way besides supporting that knight forever. So now he's supporting it with the pawn and the bishop. So black does push his C pawn to C5. Carlsen ignores it. Knight G2. He's not worried about the C file opening, which it does. Kramnik exchanges pawns on D4. And then plays bishop to D6. So he has to protect against knight to F4. He's defending that square because if he doesn't, knight to F4 will come with check. The king will be forced back to its only legal square, and then the pawn on D5 will fall as a consequence of pushing the C pawn, which is no longer defending D5. So Carlsen probably noted that when Kramnik played his rook to C8, he was intending to push the C pawn. It's the only way he could maybe get some counterplay, and so Carlsen decided, oh, that means the D pawn will be weak. Let's reroute the knight to attack it. So thinking well ahead, he does so. Pawns get exchanged, and Kramnik defends the F4 square. But Carlsen pushes his H pawn to H4, threatening maybe to push it to H5. Okay, notice how black does not want to take the knight here because bishop takes F5 check would win the exchange. The rook would be skewered. All right, so, and he also doesn't want to get his bishop forced into that situation. white can play h5 next. So black pushes h5 himself to stop the pawn. However, that turns out to be probably the last nail in the coffin. Carlsen had the position completely under his control at this point, but now it's just positionally easy for him to win because of the move knight g7 check, double attacking that h-pawn. It's only defended once. That h-pawn is going to drop, and Carlsen will get a passed h-pawn, which will be very hard to stop. So Kramnik is forced to move the king back, and then Carlsen takes the pawn with the g-pawn. So a bishop has to either exchange or fall back, and this h-pawn is protected by the knight, and it's very difficult for Kramnik to do anything about that h-pawn eventually queening. We're going to stop looking at the game here. It's a very kind of long end game, but the entire time Carlsen stays in complete control and just slowly improves his position and eventually does queen the pawn. Or he gets to the point where he's about to queen it and Kramnik resigns. You can take a look at the full game. I'll put a link in the description below. Now let's just go back to the beginning and review what we just learned. This line, d4, d5, c4 is the queen's gambit, e6, queen's gambit declined, knight c3, knight f6, c takes d5 initiates the exchange variation, black takes back with a pawn, bishop g5, pinning the knight, and we looked at this new move, c6. So our recommendation here is to play e3, intending to meet bishop to f5 with queen to f3. So we opened up that diagonal so we can get that queen to f3. You can expect the bishop to fall back to g6. You're going to capture twice on f6 and destroy the pawn cover. Now, if I were you, I would go for the same plan Carlsen did. There are different plans you could make in this position. You don't have to point both knights at the f5 square, but I think that game was a great game, and I tried to emulate it myself. So I got online, and I played until I was able to get this position. And I got this position in a blitz game on chess.com, and here's how the game went. My opponent played knight d7 just like Kramnik. And now I made an inaccuracy, not remembering all the nuances of Carlsen's game, and my game was just a blitz game. I played knight e2. Okay, if you recall, Carlsen actually played knight h4 here. He later put his knight on e2 and then g3 and pointed both knights at the f5 square. But the reason Carlsen played knight h4 first is because he wants the dark square bishop to move before he plays knight e2, because then if it calls check, it will have moved twice, losing a tempo. But the way I played the game, I played knight e2 immediately, giving black an extra tempo, and he took it. He calls check. King d1, I was not afraid of moving my king after watching that Carlsen game. Knight b6, knight g3. Now my opponent castled long. He had an extra tempo over the Kramnik game thanks to my inaccuracy, and he uses it to get to this position here. I played knight to h4, so both of my knights are pointed at f5. My opponent played knight a4, and I was kind of laughing to myself saying, go ahead, take that poisoned pawn on b2. So I put a knight on f5. I chose my h knight rather than my g knight. And my opponent took the poisoned pawn. And as soon as he did, I realized I had made a mistake in allowing him to take that, because the pawn is not actually poisoned in this position. The difference between this position, the major difference between this position and Kramnik's position, is the b7 pawn is protected thanks to the long castle. So when I played king c2 to attack the knight, my opponent should have dropped the knight back to c4. If he had, I could play king to b3. I can't get away with doing what I mentioned in the Carlsen game, because this move doesn't do anything. It doesn't attack the b7 pawn, which is defended. So that would not have been the follow-up. However, I could have played king to b3 if this had occurred, attacking both minor pieces. Notice how the knight is attacked twice, so I'm threatening to win this pawn. a5 to protect the bishop, and I can win a pawn on c4, but b5, and the pawns get expanded on the queen side. Black is gaining space, and I think this position is much better than the other ones we looked at. So black is doing great in this position. So that's how black should have played after I attacked the knight here on c2. But my opponent mistakenly brought it back to a4. And now I did remember my analysis from the Kramnik game. I attacked both minor pieces. He does temporarily save himself by attacking my rook. I move rook to c1, threatening to win 2 minor pieces for the rook. He played b5 as expected, protecting the knight. And I went ahead and won the 2 minor pieces for the rook. So I do have a material advantage. I am winning the game. Game continued h5, threatening to push the pawn to h4, and if this knight moves out of the way, then I've lost protection of my other knight. So I stopped that threat with h4. King d7, kind of interesting how my opponent is following the Kramnik idea of putting his king on e6 to try to threaten that pawn. So a lot of parallels between this game and the Carlsen-Kramnik game. But of course, we two amateurs are playing this in a much inferior way. Okay, bishop e2. I want to get my rook into the action. Rook dg8. So I realized here my g-pawn was under threat. The threat is taking the knight on f5, and then after a recapture, rook takes g2 would come. So I protect the pawn with bishop to f3. And I know the bishop looks passive on this square, but I intend to push my pawn to e4 and open up the diagonal. King e6 attacks my knight for a second time. It needs defense, and I defend it just in time with e4. My opponent doesn't have much to do in the position. He pushes a5. I activate my rook and put it in line with his king, threatening e takes d5, and my opponent exchanges on e4. I take back with the rook. This forces his king back to d7. If he had brought it forward to d5, I have a nice mate in 1. Rook to e5, mate. It's a double check, so you don't have time to take that rook. So he pushes his king back to d7. I check it by bringing my rook to the 7th rank, pushing his king back even further, and then I win the pawn on c6. Okay, my opponent sees his pawn on b5 is attacked, so he pushes it forward. I move my king over to b3. King to c4, probably a little more accurate. Rook d8. Okay, king a4, trying to get the king into the position. These pawns are obviously going to fall, but also there's a threat of just getting the king onto one of these squares and threatening to checkmate him. Rook hg8, he's just waiting for his demise. I take the a pawn. He plays king b8 and gives me a nice mate here. Rook b7 check, he moves his king back, and I mate him with the knight. If he had moved his king to a8, then I've got rook b6 check, forcing the king to a7, rook a6 check, king b8, king b6 with mate on the next move, rook to a8. So there were a lot of inaccuracies and a couple of mistakes in the game, but we did see a lot of the same themes from the Carlsen-Kramnik game. All right, so thanks for watching this part. I'll continue on with part 3 soon.